The Strange Visitor. Mr. Harris lived alone in a small wooden cabin near a deep forest. His cabin was old, but it was warm and comfortable. Every evening, Mr. Harris sat near his small window and drank hot tea. The forest outside was dark and quiet. Only the sound of wind and soft rain touched his ears. Mr. Harris was an old man, living a simple life. His family was gone, his friends were far. He liked the silence. But this night, the silence was different. It felt heavier. The wind carried a strange smell, like wet earth and something else, something sweet, but also sharp. Suddenly, loud knocking came from the door. Mr. Harris almost dropped his cup. It was very late. Nobody ever came to his cabin at this time. Slowly, he stood up, his knees hurting from old age. The knocking came again, faster this time. It sounded desperate. "Who is there?" Mr. Harris asked, his voice dry. There was no answer, only the sound of heavy breathing from outside the door. Mr. Harris took a deep breath and opened the door. A girl stood outside. But she was not a normal girl. Her skin was light blue, almost glowing in the dark. Her large eyes were silver and round like small moons. Water dripped from her hair, but her hair was not like human hair. It was soft and thin like silver grass. Her hands were shaking, her long fingers gripping the edge of the door. Mr. Harris stepped back, surprised and confused. The girl did not speak. She only looked at him, her chest moving fast like she was running for a long time. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came. Only a soft, strange sound, part whisper, part hum. Her legs were weak, and before Mr. Harris could say anything, she fell forward into his arms. The old man caught her. Her skin felt cold, but it was not the cold of rain or wind. It was different, like the cold of something not from this world. "Come inside," Mr. Harris said softly. He didn't know why he said it. Maybe it was the fear in her eyes, or the way her fingers held onto his shirt, like she was afraid to let go. He closed the door and brought her near the small fireplace. Her wet clothes left water on the wooden floor. Mr. Harris gave her an old blanket. She held it tight, like a child hiding from a storm. "Who are you?" Mr. Harris asked again. The girl's mouth opened, but her voice was broken and soft. "Sarah," she said at last. Her voice was strange, not human, but not fully alien either. It was soft, like the sound of leaves moving in the wind. Mr. Harris gave her warm tea. She held the cup with both hands, her fingers long and thin. The steam rose to her face, and for the first time, she smiled. A small, tired smile. Her eyes kept moving to the window. Every time the wind shook the trees outside, her whole body shook too. She was afraid of something. "Are you alone?" Mr. Harris asked. Sarah did not answer. She only looked down at the floor, her fingers slowly moving on the cup. It was clear. She was hiding something. Mr. Harris felt strange. This was no normal girl. Her skin, her eyes, her hands, they were too different. But she was not a monster. There was sadness in her face. There was pain in her eyes. Whoever she was, she needed help. Outside the cabin, the wind grew stronger. The rain fell harder. Somewhere deep in the forest, there was a sound. A low, growling sound. It was not an animal. It was something else. Something bigger. Something hunting. Sarah's body tensed. Her fingers dug into the wooden table. Her silver eyes grew wide. "Are they looking for you?" Mr. Harris asked, his voice soft but serious. Sarah did not speak, but her head moved slowly. "Yes." The old man stood up and locked the door. He checked the windows, making sure they were closed. Whatever was out there, it was not welcome inside. But deep inside, Mr. Harris knew trouble had already entered his cabin. Not from outside, but from the strange girl now sitting by his fire. Who was she? Why was she running? What was following her? As the rain fell harder and the forest grew darker, Mr. Harris knew this was only the beginning. The night was far from over. Silent warnings. The small cabin felt warmer now, but the warmth could not stop the strange cold in the air. Mr. Harris sat back in his old wooden chair, his eyes carefully watching the alien girl sitting near the fire. Sarah held the blanket tight around her thin body. Her silver eyes blinked slowly, like she was trying to stay awake, but her body was too tired. Mr. Harris was no fool. In his long life, he had seen many strange things, but never had he seen something like this. A girl with skin that softly glowed in the dark, with eyes that seemed to see things no human could see. Her fingers, too long for any human hand, tapped softly on the cup she still held. It was not the tapping of boredom. It was the tapping of nervousness. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping against the windows like small fingers asking to come inside. Sarah's head turned sharply at every sound, her body tense like a hunted animal. "Are you running from someone?" Mr. Harris finally asked. His voice was calm, but inside, his mind was full of questions and quiet fear. Sarah lifted her head slowly. Her silver eyes met his. For a moment, Mr. Harris saw something inside them. Not fear, but something deeper. A warning, maybe even a silent plea. She didn't answer. Instead, she sniffed the air, like a wolf catching the scent of danger. Her nostrils flared slightly, her body still wrapped in the blanket, but her senses sharp. Mr. Harris felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It was not just her strange appearance that made him uneasy. It was the feeling. The air around her felt heavy, like something invisible sat beside her, watching too. "Do you want to sleep?" he asked softly. Sarah shook her head. "Not safe," she said, her voice soft, but clear this time. "Not safe. Here?" She shook her head again, slower this time. "Forest," she whispered. "They smell me." Mr. Harris frowned. "They?" The old man's hands tightened around the armrest of his chair. There was something in the way she said it, like they were not just strangers or hunters. They were something worse, something that didn't belong in any forest on earth. "Who is looking for you?" Sarah didn't answer. Her fingers pulled the blanket tighter, and her silver eyes slowly moved to the window again. For a second, Mr. Harris thought her skin glowed brighter, just for a moment, and then it dimmed again. "Are you sick?" he asked, trying to understand her strange glowing skin. She shook her head once more. "Not sick. Change." "Change into what?" Sarah's lips trembled. Her fingers tapped faster now. A rhythm, like counting seconds. "I don't know," she whispered. "It happens. Soon." Before Mr. Harris could ask more, a low howl rose from the forest. Not the sound of a wolf, not the cry of any animal the old man had ever heard. It was long, slow, almost like a voice stretched into the wind. The sound made the cabin walls tremble slightly, and the fire in the fireplace flickered like something had sucked the air from the room. Sarah's body shook. Her silver eyes grew wide, her hands gripping the blanket so tightly her fingers turned pale blue. "Is that them?" Mr. Harris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Mr. Harris stood up, his old knees complaining with sharp pain, but he ignored it. He moved to the windows, checking each lock again. The forest was too dark, the rain too heavy, but somewhere, just beyond the tree line, he saw something. Two faint lights, like eyes, staring from the dark. They were low to the ground, but not like the eyes of a wolf or a bear. They were too steady, too bright, and they did not blink. Mr. Harris stepped back. The lights disappeared. The rain covered any sound, but the old man felt sure. Something was out there. Something waiting. "Why are they after you?" he asked, not sure if he wanted to know the answer. Sarah's eyes stayed on the window. Her breathing slowed, and her glowing skin flickered again, brighter this time. "They want me," she said softly. "It's my time." "Time for what?" She looked down at her hands. Her fingers trembled, her nails slightly sharper than before. "Mating," she whispered. Mr. Harris's breath caught in his throat. The word hung heavy in the air, strange and dangerous. He was too old to understand alien biology, but instinct told him, whatever was happening to her, it was not normal. "Is that why they're hunting you?" Syrah nodded. "They follow the smell," she said, her voice almost shaking now. "When my body changes, the smell grows stronger." Mr. Harris swallowed hard. An old man living alone in the forest had no business being part of this. But now it was too late. The strange girl was here. The hunters were coming. And deep inside the old cabin, a glow was growing, not from the fire, but from the strange visitor whose body was preparing for something neither of them could stop. As the wind howled outside and the forest shadows crept closer to the cabin, Mr. Harris knew the real danger hadn't even started yet. The change begins. The fire inside the cabin burned low, leaving soft orange light dancing across the wooden floor. Outside, the rain poured harder, tapping against the roof like restless fingers. The wind pushed against the windows, but the real storm was not outside, it was inside. Mr. Harris sat in his old chair, watching the alien girl called Syrah. She sat near the fire, her silver eyes half closed, her blue skin glowing softly, like a light inside her was flickering, growing brighter with every passing minute. The old man's heart felt heavy. His cabin had always been a place of peace, a quiet world, far from noise, far from trouble. But now it felt different. The air was too thick, too alive. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Syrah's fingers twitched under the blanket. Her breathing grew strange, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, like her body was fighting itself. She was no longer just afraid of the hunters outside. Something was happening inside her. "What's wrong?" Mr. Harris asked, his voice softer than before. "Are you cold? Hungry?" Syrah shook her head. Her silver hair clung to her skin, damp with sweat. "No," she whispered. "It's starting." Mr. Harris leaned forward. "What's starting?" Syrah's hands shook harder. Her nails, which had looked normal before, were now slightly longer, sharper at the tips. Her skin glowed brighter, the light moving under her skin, like liquid stars flowing through her veins. "My body," she said, her voice trembling. "It's preparing." "For what?" Syrah closed her eyes. Her breathing grew heavier, and when she opened her mouth to speak, her teeth had changed, just a little, sharper, more pointed, like a predator. "For mating." The old man's fingers gripped the arms of his chair. He didn't fully understand alien biology, but the word carried weight. It was not just about love or connection. It was about instinct, about something deeper than thought, something wild. "What happens if you don't find a mate?" he asked carefully. Syrah's eyes flicked open, wide, bright, and full of fear. "If no mate," she said slowly, "I lose control." The words hung in the air, heavy as stone. Mr. Harris's throat went dry. He had been alone for many years, used to silence, used to peace. But now, there was something growing inside his cabin, something dangerous. And it wasn't outside, with the hunters. It was sitting by his fire. Syrah's breathing became sharper, faster. Her back arched slightly, like her muscles were pulling themselves tight. The soft glow under her skin flared brighter, making her veins visible through her thin skin. Her silver eyes turned darker, the color bleeding into black at the edges. Mr. Harris stood up slowly. "Is there anything I can do to help you?" Syrah's head snapped toward him too fast, her neck bending at a strange angle. For a brief second, her eyes didn't look afraid. They looked hungry. Then, as quickly as it came, the look vanished, and she curled her arms around herself, rocking slightly. "Don't come close," she whispered. "It's too soon. I can't stop it." The wind outside howled, but inside the cabin, a new sound joined it. A soft, low growl, coming not from the forest, but from Syrah's throat. Her body shivered violently, and her skin changed. Soft blue patches darkened, turning almost silver, then back to blue again. Her fingers flexed, her nails lengthening, her breathing turning into short, sharp pants. Mr. Harris stepped back, heart pounding. This was no sickness. This was not a fever or a simple reaction. This was evolution, right in front of his eyes. The air inside the cabin felt charged, like a storm was trapped inside the walls. Syrah's scent, soft, sweet, almost floral, filled the room. But there was something under it now, something sharp, metallic, almost like blood. She was changing. Not slowly, not over days or weeks. It was happening now. Outside, the strange eyes returned, low to the ground, just at the edge of the trees. They were closer now, glowing faintly through the rain. Whatever was hunting her knew her time had come. The hunters were not guessing. They could smell it. Syrah's body twitched again, her back arching, her skin glowing even brighter. Her silver hair lifted slightly, as though touched by an invisible breeze. Her breath came in shudders, her throat vibrating with that low, alien growl. Mr. Harris' hands trembled, but he did not run. Something told him that running would be worse. If Syrah's instincts fully took over, she would not see him as friend or protector, only prey or mate. "You have to fight it," Mr. Harris said, his voice trembling. "You can control it." Syrah shook her head violently. "No, I can't." Her voice broke into a low, keening sound, almost like a mix between a sob and a howl. Her eyes rolled back, her hands clawing at the floor, her nails digging into the wood. The rain outside masked the sound of footsteps, soft, careful, approaching the cabin from the dark. But inside, the storm had already begun. The girl by the fire was no longer just a refugee, no longer just a frightened visitor. She was becoming something else, something her own kind feared, something her hunters followed. And if she lost herself completely, there would be no one left to save. Not her, not Mr. Harris. The old man stood between the door and the girl, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. He had no weapon, no plan, no chance. All he had was the hope that something human still remained inside her. But the glow beneath her skin told him the truth. The change had only just begun. And the real danger was already inside. Mating season. The storm outside grew louder, but the storm inside the cabin was much worse. The small room was filled with strange light, soft and silver, coming from Syrah's glowing skin. The glow pulsed, bright and dim, like a heartbeat too strong for her fragile body to hold. Mr. Harris stood near the table, watching her carefully. His old hands shook, not from cold, but from fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the thing she was becoming. Syrah sat on the floor now, no longer near the fire. The warmth seemed to make her worse. Her silver hair stuck to her face, damp with sweat. Her thin arms wrapped around her knees, her long fingers twitching, nails too sharp, too alien. Her breathing filled the room, not soft human breathing, but something faster, rougher, with a low growl hiding underneath. Every breath was a struggle, like her body was fighting her mind. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, trying to stay calm. "Syrah," he said softly, "you have to tell me. What's happening to you?" Syrah lifted her head slowly. Her silver eyes glowed brighter than before, but there was no anger in them, only pain, confusion, and fear. Her lips trembled as she tried to explain. "My species," she said, her voice soft but shaking. We do not choose when to mate. Our bodies decide. The cycle comes, and we cannot stop it." Her fingers dug into her arms, leaving thin scratches on her blue skin. "When the cycle starts, my body changes. My senses get sharper. My skin glows, so a mate can find me in the dark." Her voice caught for a moment. "But if there is no mate, my mind breaks." Mr. Harris' chest tightened. "What do you mean, breaks?" Syrah's glowing eyes filled with tears. I lose myself. My body takes control. I become something wild, something dangerous. Her skin glowed brighter for a second, and she gasped, clutching her stomach like something inside was burning her. It's starting faster this time, she whispered, because I am alone. Mr. Harris felt a chill run down his spine. He was no scientist, no expert, but he understood instinct. He had seen it in wild animals, in wolves during mating season, in deer running madly through the forest. But this was different. This was not just nature. This was something alien, something far more powerful. Is there any way to stop it? He asked. Sira shook her head. No, my body needs to bond, to connect. Without it, the energy inside me has nowhere to go. Her fingers twitched again. It will break me apart, or I will break everything around me. Her glowing skin flickered again, brighter this time. The soft, sweet scent in the air grew thicker, like flowers and smoke mixed together. It was not perfume. It was her body calling out, reaching for a mate, even when no mate was there. Mr. Harris backed up a step, his heart pounding. Can't you control it? You're strong. Sira's laugh was soft and sad. No one can control it. Not my people. Not me. Outside, the forest was too quiet. The rain covered most sounds, but underneath, Mr. Harris thought he heard something. Soft footsteps, moving carefully through the wet leaves. Not one pair, several. They're close, Sira whispered. They smell me now. Who are they? Mr. Harris asked, but he already knew the answer. My kind, Sira said. Hunters. They follow the scent. They don't want me safe. They want to use me. Use you how? Sira's eyes filled with anger for the first time. To breed their army, she said softly. To make more like me, but not free like me. Controlled. Owned. Mr. Harris's fists clenched. Not in my cabin. They won't. But Sira wasn't listening anymore. Her breathing grew faster again. The glow under her skin became a sharp pulse, like a heartbeat outside her body. Her silver eyes darkened at the edges, turning almost black. Her long fingers gripped the floor, nails digging into the wood, leaving deep scratches. The scent in the air grew sharper, richer, almost overwhelming. Mr. Harris felt his own mind get hazy for a second. Not attraction, but confusion, like her scent was designed to call something buried deep inside any living creature near her. Sira, he said, louder this time. Focus on me. Don't lose yourself. Her eyes snapped to him, bright and wild. I can't stop it, she whispered, her voice trembling. I need. She froze, her head tilting sharply toward the door. The soft footsteps outside were closer now. Something scratched lightly against the wall of the cabin, just outside. Long fingers testing the wood. The hunters had arrived. Sarah's body shook harder, torn between fear of the hunters and the wild instinct inside her. The air inside the cabin grew hot, heavy, thick with her scent. Every breath felt like breathing steam. Mr. Harris stood between her and the door, his heart racing, his old hands shaking. He was no warrior. He was just a man with an old cabin and a heart too soft to turn away a girl in trouble. But now, that kindness might cost him everything. Sira's body arched, her mouth opening in a silent scream. Her skin pulsed, the glow running down her arms, her legs, her neck, like liquid fire under her skin. Her scent grew sharper again, and her silver eyes locked on Mr. Harris. Her voice was soft, but full of something ancient, something primal. Run, she said. But Mr. Harris didn't move. Not yet. Outside, the hunters waited. Inside, the girl he saved was no longer just a visitor. She was something far older, far stronger, and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And the mating season had only just begun. The hunters arrived. The rain had softened, but the silence outside was worse than any storm. Every crack of a twig, every soft splash of mud felt louder than thunder. Mr. Harris stood near the door, his hands trembling slightly, though he tried to keep them steady. He was no hero, no fighter. He was just an old man with a quiet life, a life that was no longer quiet. Behind him, Sarah crouched near the fire, her body shaking with every breath. Her skin glowed brighter now, no longer soft and gentle, but sharp and flickering, like a light bulb about to burst. Her silver hair clung to her damp skin, and her silver eyes had almost completely turned black at the edges. She wasn't just afraid. She was changing. Mr. Harris could feel it in the air, something invisible pressing against the cabin walls, something not from this world. The scent inside the room was thicker, stronger, like sweet flowers mixed with burnt metal. It clung to everything. The walls, the floor, even Mr. Harris's skin. It was a call, and whoever was out there had heard it. A soft scrape came from the wall outside, a long, slow drag of something sharp against the wood. Mr. Harris's breath caught in his throat. It was not the wind, not a tree branch. It was fingers, testing the cabin's strength. "They're here," Sarah whispered. Her voice was not fully hers anymore. There was a second tone beneath it, deeper, stranger, like another voice was trying to speak through her. Mr. Harris turned toward her. "What do they want, exactly?" "Just you." Sarah shook her head, her silver eyes flickering back to their normal shine for a moment. "Not just me," she said softly. "They want control." "Control of what?" "Of my body, my mind, my mating season." Mr. Harris's stomach turned. It was not just about catching her. It was about using her. Her body was valuable, not for who she was, but for what she could create. Offspring. A new generation. "How do they control you?" he asked. Sarah's fingers dug into the floor again, her nails leaving deep grooves in the wood. "They inject something," she said softly. "A chemical. It blocks my mind. It makes me obey." Mr. Harris's fists clenched. "Not here. Not while I'm breathing." A soft knock came at the door. It was gentle, polite even, but it made Mr. Harris's blood run cold. It was too soft for a fist, too careful for a wild animal. It was a test. "Do not open," Sarah whispered. Her whole body trembled, not just from fear, but from the growing storm inside her. The knock came again, a little harder this time, followed by a low hum from the other side. The sound was not human. It was too smooth, too perfect, like a machine trying to sound like a man. Mr. Harris's heart pounded. The hunters were not kicking down doors. They were waiting, waiting for Sarah to break, waiting for her instincts to force her to run. "They don't want to fight," Mr. Harris realized aloud. "They want you to go outside." Sarah's blackened eyes flicked toward the door, her body shaking harder. "They know," she whispered. "My body wants a mate. My scent calls to them. They know I will come." Mr. Harris stepped between her and the door. "Not tonight." A sharp laugh echoed from outside. Not a natural laugh, but a twisted mockery of one. More soft footsteps circled the cabin, slow and careful. The hunters were patient. They had time. Sarah's breathing turned ragged, her hands clenching into fists. "I can't hold it much longer." "Hold what?" Mr. Harris asked, fear building in his chest. "My body," Sarah said. "It's not just mating. My species. When the season comes, we change. Our instincts take over. We fight. We hunt. We destroy." Her hands shook harder, the glow under her skin pulsing brighter, faster. The change was not just starting. It was racing forward, pushed faster by the fear. The scent, the presence of the hunters so close. The door creaked softly, the wood bending as something leaned against it from the outside. The smell of wet earth and metal filled the air, mixing with Sarah's scent. Mr. Harris grabbed his old rifle from above the fireplace. It was rusty, barely working, but it was something. "You said they want you alive, right?" Sarah nodded, her lips trembling. "They won't kill me, but they might kill you." Mr. Harris smiled weakly. They'll have to work for it. Another soft laugh came from the darkness outside, followed by a whisper, a language Mr. Harris couldn't understand, smooth and sharp like glass breaking underwater. But Syrah understood. Her whole body jerked at the sound, her skin flashing brighter. "They're calling me," she said softly. "Calling my body." Her silver eyes locked on Mr. Harris, wide and terrified. "If I lose control, I might hurt you." "You won't," Mr. Harris said, though he wasn't sure if it was true. Her breath came faster, the alien scent filling the room so thick it made the old man dizzy. It was meant for her kind, not for a human. It clouded the mind, stirred ancient instincts. Fight, mate, run. The door handle rattled softly. The hunters were getting tired of waiting. Mr. Harris raised the rifle, the old wood heavy in his hands. "If they come in, I'll handle them." Syrah's fingers dug into her own arms, her nails cutting into her blue skin. The glow flickered wildly now, her body fighting itself, nature pulling her one way, fear pulling her another. "They will come," she whispered. "Let them," Mr. Harris said. Outside, the rain had almost stopped, only the soft sound of breathing. Too many breaths surrounded the cabin. The hunters had come for Syrah. But tonight, they would meet something else. An old man with a shaking rifle, a girl fighting her own body, and a storm inside her more dangerous than any weapon. The mating season was no longer just her curse. Now it was everyone's problem. Wild instincts unleashed. The air inside the cabin was no longer just heavy. It was alive. It pulsed with something ancient, something primal, a tension so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Syrah's soft glow had become a steady light, flickering along her arms, her neck, even her face. It was not the soft beauty of before. Now it was wild, uncontrolled, like fire crawling under her skin. Mr. Harris stood near the door, the old rifle trembling slightly in his hands. His heart pounded in his chest, but his eyes stayed on Syrah. She was no longer just a frightened girl. She was something between two forms, stuck between who she was and what her body demanded her to become. Syrah's silver eyes darkened further, the black spreading deeper into the center. Her breathing had changed too, no longer soft and panicked. Now it was rough, almost animal-like, deep in her throat, each breath sounding like she was trying to hold something back. Her fingers dug into the wooden floor again, her long nails cutting through the old wood like soft dirt. Her whole body trembled, not from fear, but from the storm inside her. Her muscles twitched, her skin rippling as the glow pulsed faster, too fast. It was like her body was preparing for a fight, even though her mind wanted to stay still. "I can't hold it," Syrah whispered, her voice no longer fully hers. There was a second voice layered beneath it, deeper, older, hungrier. Mr. Harris took a slow step toward her. "You're still here," he said softly. "I can see it in your eyes." Syrah shook her head violently, silver hair flying. "No," she whispered. "I'm losing." Outside the cabin, the hunters moved closer. Soft footsteps circled the cabin, sometimes stopping, sometimes scraping claws along the wood. They were patient. They had chased her before. They knew the signs. Her scent was too strong now, too sweet, too ripe. They didn't need to break in. They only needed to wait. Mr. Harris could feel it too, not desire, but something alien, something that tugged at some ancient part of the brain. Whatever scent Syrah's body was releasing, it was not meant for humans, but even he could feel its pull, like a whisper in the dark. Syrah's back arched sharply, her mouth opening in a soundless scream. Her skin flared, the soft glow turning white-hot for a moment before fading again. Her muscles rippled under her skin, bones shifting slightly, too slightly to see, but enough to make her twitch in pain. "What's happening to you?" Mr. Harris asked, stepping closer. Her silver eyes snapped to his face, wide with terror and something else. Hunger. Not hunger for food. Hunger for completion. Her body needed something, and if it couldn't find it, it would take. My species, she said through clenched teeth. We don't ask. We take. Her fingers dug deeper into the wood, her breathing a low snarl now. If there's no mate, I become the hunter. Mr. Harris' mouth went dry. You mean, you'd hunt me? Sarah's body shook violently at the word. I won't hurt you, she said, but her voice was a lie. Her own body didn't care about promises. It didn't care about kindness. It only wanted what it was made for. A bond, a mate, survival. The glow under her skin brightened again, flashing like a beacon. Outside, the hunters growled softly, answering her call. They were closer now, just beyond the thin walls of the cabin. Cyrus' fingers clenched the floor, her nails leaving deep scars in the wood. They'll break in soon, she said softly. But I might break first. Mr. Harris didn't move back. He didn't run. I'm not leaving you. Her silver eyes softened for a second, just a second, before the glow flared again, brighter than before. Her back arched, her head falling back, her mouth opening in a low, unnatural sound, a mix of a purr and a growl. Her scent thickened again, wrapping around the cabin like invisible smoke, filling every breath. Mr. Harris's vision blurred for a moment, dizziness washing over him as his body tried to understand something it was never meant to understand. Cyrus' body shifted again, her spine curving slightly, her fingers stretching longer, her teeth just a little too sharp. Her human softness was fading, and something older was crawling to the surface. Her blackened eyes locked on Mr. Harris again. But this time, they were not just afraid. They were focused on him. Run, she whispered, before I can't stop myself. Mr. Harris raised his rifle, not to aim at her, but toward the door. I'm not running. Cyrus' breathing slowed for a second, her face caught between fear and something deeper. Why? Because you're still in there, Mr. Harris said. You haven't hurt me yet. Her eyes flickered, the blackness pulling back just a little. But I will. Not tonight, Mr. Harris said. Outside, the soft knock came again, a polite reminder that the hunters were still waiting. They could sense her struggle. They were letting her instincts do the work for them. Cyrus' body arched again, the glow in her chest brightening, her skin almost translucent now, light flowing through her veins like liquid metal. Her breath caught in her throat, and she made a soft, keening sound. A cry, a plea, an apology. Her hands shook, claws halfway grown, her skin almost splitting from the pressure inside. Every part of her was on fire, her instincts screaming louder than her thoughts. But somewhere inside that storm, the girl was still there. Hold on, Mr. Harris whispered. Hold on for me. Cyrus' silver eyes blinked, just once, soft and sad, before the blackness flooded back. Her body lunged forward, hands clawing the air, stopping just inches from Mr. Harris's chest. Her breathing was a low snarl, her body shaking violently. But she stopped. She hadn't attacked. Not yet. Outside, the hunter's laughter grew louder. Inside, the girl was losing her war. And the man standing in front of her was the only thing keeping her from crossing the line. The glow in her skin flickered, bright, dim, bright, like a dying star fighting to stay alive. The mating season wasn't over, but Cyrus' time was running out. And so was Mr. Harris. Escape or doom. The soft, polite knocking on the door stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. Mr. Harris stood perfectly still, the old rifle heavy in his hands, but the weapon felt useless. What good was an old gun against creatures who could smell desire and fear like smoke in the air? The thin wooden door was the only thing between him and the hunters outside. But the real danger was already inside. Sarah crouched low near the fireplace, her silver skin bright with wild light, the glow flashing beneath her skin like trapped lightning. Her breathing had become a sharp mix of growls and soft whimpers. Her fingers dug into the floor so deeply now that small pieces of wood splintered around her claws. Her silver eyes were almost fully black now. Only the faintest thin ring of light remained. It flickered every time she gasped, like her own identity was hanging by a thread. Mr. Harris's voice shook, but he kept it soft. "Sarah, you're still in there. Hold on." Sarah's body trembled violently, her legs folding under her, muscles twitching under her glowing skin. I'm trying," she whispered, her voice layered with two tones, her voice and the deep, primal sound of the thing she was becoming. "But they're calling me. My body. It wants them." Outside, something heavy brushed against the wall. A slow, sliding movement, like fingers dragging across wet wood. The hunters weren't leaving. They were waiting for her to break. Mr. Harris knew the truth. The mating season wasn't just a cycle. It was a trap written into her blood. Her own body was betraying her, calling out to the very creatures she was running from. Every moment she resisted, the change inside her grew stronger, angrier. The polite tapping on the door returned. 3 soft knocks, almost mocking. This time, a voice followed. "Sarah." The voice was soft, too soft. Wrong. It carried no real feeling, only cold patience. It wasn't a voice asking. It was a voice expecting. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her body jerking forward like her bones were pulling her to the door. Her claws scraped across the floor as she fought to stay still, but her legs twitched, her instincts screaming to follow that voice. Mr. Harris took a slow step toward her. "Don't listen." "I can't," Sarah whispered. Her silver hair clung to her face, wet with sweat. Her glowing skin was so bright now that it lit the whole cabin, flickering shadows on the walls. "My body wants them. It's made to want them." "But you don't," Mr. Harris said. "You're not just your body." The black in her eyes flickered, the smallest hint of silver returning for a heartbeat. She gasped, her hands gripping her head, claws digging into her own scalp, trying to fight. "I don't want them." Her voice cracked, not from fear, but from the war inside her. Outside, the hunters moved closer. Their breathing, soft, calm, steady, filled the air. They were patient, but they were ready. They had chased her across the stars, across worlds, across forests. And now they were only inches away. A soft scraping sound slid across the window. A finger, or maybe a claw, tracing a slow circle on the glass. Sarah's body jerked again, her muscles spasming, her teeth bared. She wasn't fighting the hunters anymore. She was fighting herself. "My body knows them," she whispered. "It wants them. It remembers." "But your heart," Mr. Harris said, his voice soft but firm, "doesn't." Sarah's trembling fingers reached for him, not to attack, but to anchor herself. Her long claws scratched the floor as she crawled closer, her glowing skin flickering wildly. Her breath was hot and ragged, her scent thick in the air. Alien, sweet, dangerous. The hunters could smell it too. They pressed closer, so close that their shadows stretched across the cabin walls through the window. Mr. Harris knelt beside her, one hand still holding the rifle, the other reaching out. "You're not alone." Sarah's blackened eyes locked on his face, wide and full of terror, and something else. Trust. Then the door shook. The polite knocking turned into a heavy, desperate pounding, the thin wood creaking under the force. The hunters were done waiting. Sarah's body arched sharply, her back curving, her mouth opening in a soundless scream. Her skin flared so brightly it hurt to look at her. Her claws scraped deep lines into the floor as her whole body fought itself. "They'll take me," she gasped. "They always take us." "Not tonight," Mr. Harris said. His hand closed around hers, the alien skin hot under his touch, her fingers trembling but holding on. The door burst open. The first hunter stepped inside. Tall, thin, its skin dark and smooth, its face featureless except for glowing slits where eyes should be. It moved like liquid, silent despite its size, the soft, wet smell of rain and metal surrounding it. It froze when it saw Mr. Harris standing there, rifle raised. But that wasn't what made it pause. It was Syrah. Her glowing skin flared so brightly, the hunter took a step back. Her silver eyes, still flickering with blackness, locked on the intruder. Her body trembled, caught between running to them or tearing them apart. "Mine," Syrah whispered, but her voice was wrong. It was not a claim of love. It was a claim of territory. The hunter lunged. The old rifle fired, once, twice, the sound deafening in the small cabin. One shot missed, slamming into the wall. The second grazed the hunter's arm, dark fluid spraying across the floor. The hunter didn't cry out. It only watched. It wasn't afraid. It knew the real weapon wasn't the gun. It was Syrah. Syrah's body tensed, every muscle locking as the final wave of the mating season flooded her veins. Her glowing skin pulsed so brightly that the hunters outside hissed softly, a sound of awe and hunger mixed together. Mr. Harris stood between her and the hunters, but it wasn't his rifle that held them back. It was her. Her instincts had finally found something to anchor to. Him. Not as a mate, but as her protector. Her silver eyes cleared, just for a second, as her shaking fingers clutched Mr. Harris's hand tighter. "Not them," she whispered. "Never them." Then, with a wild scream that shook the whole cabin, Syrah turned toward the hunters. And they realized, too late, that this time she wasn't running. This time she was hunting them.